The funeral is about to begin, sir.
Good evening. You're listening to Morningside FM, the podcast where we talk all things Phantasm. And we really have been talking all things Phantasm. So far, we've discussed philosophy and funerals, but now I think it's finally time to get down to it, to discuss the original Phantasm movie itself. Throughout the course of this podcast, I'm going to be having deep dive discussions on each of the 5 films in the Phantasm franchise, and joining me now to discuss the original, the one where it all began, is Kevin Lyons. Kevin is an editor and researcher for the BFI, but I and many others know him for his fantastic work over at the Encyclopedia of Fantastic Film and Television. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, before we get down to all things phantasmagorical, just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself.
I'm Kevin Lyons. I edit a website called EOFFTV.com, which is the rather tongue-twisting encyclopedia of fantastic film and television. Back in 2001, when I launched it, that sounded like a good idea. I never thought I'd have to say it out loud quite as often as I have recently. But I've done lots of podcasts. If you're very unlucky, you'll have heard me droning on things like Evolution of Horror and Journey Through Sci-Fi, my favourite film, and so on. I do commentaries and booklets, and when they're trying specifically to frighten the children, they'll allow me on camera, and I will actually sit there and have a ramble on about things, as I'm prone to do, and as I will certainly be doing with this one.
Fantastic. And it's a wonderful website. There have been some great reviews on there recently.
Thank you.
The animated Lord of the Rings one. I have a real soft spot for that film. And, of course, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Oh, well, everybody's got a soft spot for Hitchhiker's Guide. That's a gorgeous thing.
Especially that TV series. You know, the visuals are just so striking.
Yeah. It's so much better. It's so much better than the very expensive feature film, to be perfectly honest.
So
it's
much.
Terrible. Yeah, but the cheap old made it for 30p with a bit of sticky tape. That was great.
So talking of cheap old made for 30p with a bit of sticky tape, good old Phantasm.
Yes. Good old Phantasm.
So when did you first see this film?
Well, I think I can narrow it down to the month, if not the day. Because I'm old, I saw it when it was in cinemas first time around, September 1979.
I'm so jealous.
Well, these are the one good thing about being old, is that you manage to see all this stuff. And the late 70s was fantastic. I was living on the Isle of Wight at the time, where there isn't now much else to do, to be fair, except go to the cinema. And some friends of mine owned a record store. Still am a big record collector. They advertised in the local... Younger people may not know this, but when you used to go to the cinema, they used to give you a little free magazine.
Yeah.
Which was full of adverts for local businesses and not much else. You remember those?
Yeah, they had them when I was very little, but then they tailed out.
They did. Well, this couple who owned this record store took out an advert in the magazine. They weren't really into films. They said, "Do you want the free ticket that comes with it, Kev?" So every week I was going, and sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, because I'd go to different cinemas and pretend I hadn't used it yet.
Yeah.
Different things. And Phantasm would have been one of those.
Wow.
And I think it was possibly on a double bill with The Groove Tube.
Right.
It's a kind of Kentucky Fried Movie style sort of sketch comedy thing.
Okay.
It was on a double bill with something, and when I looked up on newspaper archives for September 79, that's what was showing with Phantasm.
Right.
And I know I've seen The Groove Tube, so I'm assuming that that's what I saw it with. I was the tender age of 17.
Oh, fantastic.
So actually too young to see it.
Yeah.
The good thing about being old is back in the late 70s, no one gave a damn. I was 6'5" when I was 14, and I was born with what I believe the young people of today call the resting bitch face. Basically, that expression that even when I'm fantastically happy, I've still got this expression of just sod off and leave me alone.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody at the cinemas really wanted to argue with me, so they just let me in.
No, not a problem getting in there.
It wasn't, no.
You see, when I was younger, we had to do the thing of buying a ticket for a 12 film, but then sneaking in to the 18. Yeah.
To be honest, there were several times at the one multiplex that we had on the island that I would use my pass to go in for the afternoon horror double bill and then just lurk around in the toilets or somewhere nearby until the next film in the next screen started and go in and watch that as well. So
Perfect.
But hey, don't tell anybody I did this. I'll get into terrible trouble.
So when it comes to Phantasm, it's a very divisive film because there are some that say it makes no sense whatsoever because it's disjointed, there's no plot, and nothing makes any sense. But then the people who think it's a masterpiece say it's a masterpiece because it's disjointed, there is no plot, and nothing that happens makes any sense.
Well, when you look at what else was out at that time in September 79, you've got things like John Badham's version of Dracula. Now, no matter what you think of Dracula, it's a very traditional, very old-fashioned Gothic horror film.
Yeah.
The latest John Carpenter, it wasn't Halloween, that had been and gone. It was Elvis the movie. You've got films like The Main Events, Quadrophenia.
Yeah.
The aforementioned Lord of the Rings was still in cinemas, and the first Mad Max. And the first Mad Max is the most conventional of all of them. And then suddenly Phantasm turned up. And it was like, what the hell is this? Seriously, at the age of 17, I'd never seen anything quite like this. And it was on that first viewing, I think I had that kind of feeling that I think a lot of people have when they first see Phantasm. You're so perplexed by it all, you don't actually know if you liked it or not. Because it's just so overwhelming. It's just so odd. It's so weird. You kind of sit there thinking, I genuinely don't know what to think about this. So I went back later that week and watched it again just to be sure.
I imagine in many ways you're still trying to work out what's going on with it and still rewatching.
Oh, yeah. That's why we keep going back. Absolutely. I mean, those people who say, it doesn't make any sense. Well, I'm sorry, guys. I don't want it to make any sense.
No.
If I understood it, it would be just another horror film. We'll talk about the sequels later, perhaps, but I find that the sequels are far more mundane. They're far more horror films. And they're good horror films.
Yeah. The second one especially, yeah. Because I think the studio intervened and said, it must have a linear plot, no dream scenes, must explain.
That's right, yeah. No dream scenes, plot, yeah. And none of that was what we wanted. Yeah, we didn't want that. We wanted the weirdness. We wanted all this crazy stuff happening. And that was what was so beautiful about it. Just sitting there in the cinema, scratching my head at the end thinking, I honestly don't know. I think I love it, but I'm not sure yet. That was my first reaction.
Well, it's interesting you should say that because I didn't get to see it on the big screen, although I did eventually in 2016 for the BFI screening of the remastered version, which was just absolutely incredible. Finally to have the opportunity to sit in a darkened cinema and watch it in the dark with Don Coscarelli sat behind me. What an experience. But
excellent.
Back when I was a teenager, I saw it like many people did for the first time by renting it on VHS. And I think Phantasm is the archetypal cult video store horror in many ways. And I was probably about 12 or 13 when I saw it. And it was a time in my life when I was kind of discovering all the classic horror films for the first time. And, I saw it in the same month, if not even the same week, as things like Halloween, Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street. And in many ways, Phantasm was just one of the many horror films that I was enjoying. But it was only sort of as time crept on that I realised that was the one that I kept thinking about. That was the one I kept going back to. And eventually that was the one that I bought on VHS and then just watched to death.
Of course. I think, when you have that morass of genre films, which we did late 70s, early 80s, there were not quite like it is today, where there's a horror film being released roughly every 30 seconds. But back then there was still a lot of films coming out. It was the one that did stick out. It was the one that you went away sort of slightly nonplussed about what you'd seen, but you kept thinking about it.
Yeah.
And you kept thinking, do you remember that? You talk to your mates. Have you seen that really weird film? The one with the ball in it, and the one with the girls having sex and kills a guy at the beginning, and everybody's going, "Oh yeah, I remember that one."
That, yeah.
And nobody could remember what it was called at the time, and nobody could remember the details, but they remembered it was just so weird.
Yeah.
It was just so unusual that they...
It's interesting you should say that, because in many ways it's sort of like when you wake up from a nightmare and you have this string of disjointed images that are really vivid, but you can't quite remember exactly what was going on and what was I doing? Well, you know.
That's right. And of course, you know, the whole film is very dreamlike.
Yeah.
It came to Coscarelli in a dream.
Yeah.
You know, the genesis of it was that, you know, you've probably already spoken about this, but him having this nightmare of running down a marbled corridor being pursued by a flying ball.
Of course, yeah.
And that becomes, you know, the central image, not only of the film, but of the entire franchise.
Yeah.
He sort of, that's what's so beautiful about that first one. It is like watching somebody else's dream.
Yes.
And you don't really get that with the later ones.
There's a simplicity about it that elevates it somehow. Now, we're talking about this film in the context of horror movies, because it is a horror movie.
It is.
Yes.
And
it has, you know, all these quite sort of gothic trappings. But then, of course, we get 3/4 of the way into the film and we have the Spacegate sequence. Now, I know you're a huge science fiction fan.
I am.
So, yeah, your reaction to the Red Planet. You know, when you think you're about to, I don't know, meet the devil or go into hell, but then it becomes trans-dimensional.
Exactly. Well, you know, it's funny that around 79, 80, something like that, a lot of the films from, you know, much earlier on were still in circulation. And one of those films that was still in circulation was 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yes.
Which the first time I saw it was on the big screen. And it is my all-time favourite film ever. It's the one film I'll go back to over and over again. And so, yeah, when you get this sort of Spacegate sequence, I'm thinking, hang on a minute, this guy knows his stuff. He's been watching the right films, hasn't he?
Yeah, Don was definitely a fan, yeah.
A big fan, yeah, you can definitely tell that. And there were other kind of little references in it as well, that, you know, the sort of strange shrunken slaves that you find on the other side of the gate. I don't think they were directly influenced by Star Wars, because, you know, the Phantasm was in production for a long time, but they are Jawas. Yeah, but they're Jawas. You know, they look just like Jawas.
Yeah.
I think in Coscarelli's mind, he was kind of thinking, you know, sort of cowled figures. They're more like the Gothic monk type figures.
Very much
but
so.
It's just one of those things. It just happened. It was just, you know, something of the zeitgeist, you know. And it was weird.
Yeah, apparently, you know, they'd already been making Phantasm since 77. Then when the trailer for Star Wars came out and they saw the Jawas, Don was like, oh no!
Oh no!
And of course, the other thing, you know, like you say, Don's dream about being pursued by the sphere. Now, in the dream, it never caught up with him, because that's what dreams are like. The fear, that's
the terror.
That's the terror of it.
Exactly.
But for the film, he had to think, well, what will happen when this sphere catches up with them? And his initial thought was a hypodermic needle. But then, of course, again in that Star Wars trailer, you get Darth Vader interrogating Leia with the hypodermic needle in a floating sphere.
Do you know, I'm not a great fan of Star Wars. I hold it personally responsible for a good many things that went wrong with cinema, and he's a good example. Poor old Don Coscarelli.
Poor Don.
But there's another big science fiction reference, of course, which doesn't always get picked up on, although it's there, right there in front of us the whole time.
Invaders from Mars?
Invaders from Mars is one, but there hadn't been a film made of it yet. But Dune.
Of course.
Dune is referenced several times. You've got Dune's Cantina.
Yeah.
Which is the name of the bar.
Yep.
You've got the bit where he goes to see the psychic.
Of course,
and she makes him put his hand in the box. Which is the Gom Jabbar scene.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I don't know if David Lynch is a Phantasm fan or not, although I think at some point in every episode of this podcast, somebody has used the word Lynchian. And with Phantasm, you sort of think, is it trashy or is it elevated, or can it be both?
It could be whatever it wants to be.
But I think it has that simple brilliance in terms of, you know, again, that simplicity of it, the purity of emotion, and that idea that, you know, the scenes might not necessarily flow together in any kind of linear or narrative sense, but as individual set pieces, as moving paintings, you know, they're successful in evoking an emotion or a fear or something. Now, I think David Lynch is sort of more skillful at that side of things. You know, I think he knows exactly what he wants to achieve, and he achieves it. Now, whether or not anybody else can understand it is another matter.
And I don't think he cares, to be honest. He doesn't care whether we get it or not. That's not his job to make it understandable, you know?
Yeah, exactly. But, the last time I was watching Twin Peaks, I couldn't help but notice, the red velvet drapes and, the marble statues. And I thought, this is all very Morningside.
It is.
And then, of course, now, obviously, Don may have been inspired by the Dune novel, but then there's the film which came afterwards. But I do wonder if that's taking some visual cues from Phantasm. Now, I hesitate to name check David Lynch as the director of the original Dune movie because he famously disowned it.
And I can understand that. Yeah, I can understand that.
But if you watch those films, the hand in the box scenes side by side, the angles and the camera work is very
indeed. And it's there in the novel, but yes, it is in the film. It's much more in line with what you see in Phantasm. And of course, everybody sort of says, oh, when we get to the desert planet on the other side of the Stargate, because there's Jawas, it must be Tatooine. But I think he was probably thinking, actually, it's Arrakis. This is another reference to Dune. So, there are several references throughout the film to a film that hadn't been made yet, but the book was hugely popular. And I just read the book around that time. So Phantasm was kind of perfect. I'd just seen 2001. I'd read Dune.
Oh, wow.
Halloween had been out, so horror was beginning to come back in, and it just suddenly this thing just dropped down into my lap, and it was like, oh my god, all these things that I don't. All the right ingredients that I don't understand, but my god, it's brilliant. It's really, really good.
So just going back to, I mentioned before the wonderful evolution of horror podcast, and it was quite a while ago now, back on their Alien season, and you were talking about War of the Worlds, just in relation to the Red Planet, and you were talking about the whole perceived commie threat that found its way into a lot of science fiction in the 50s and whatnot.
That's right. Yeah,
and there was a phrase that you used in terms of that red threat, and it being counter to the American way of life. Now, I don't think that's where Don's brain was at all when coming up with Phantasm, but that choice of phrase, American way of life, just struck a chord with me, because when it comes to Phantasm, Don has often said that these films sort of came from his fascination with and fear of the American way of death. And I thought, well, what could be more antithetical to the American way of life than the American way of death? And that's what the Tall Man is. That's what Phantasm is, isn't it?
Exactly. But, you mentioned Invaders from Mars earlier, and Phantasm definitely has that kind of feeling of that. And that was, of course, very much part of that sort of Red Scare 1950s science fiction cycle. Like you say, I don't think it was what was on his mind when he was making this film. But sometimes you can find something in films which clearly wasn't on the minds of the director, but it's still there. Maybe it was subconscious,
like the Jawas, that zeitgeist,
Yeah, and of course, I'm sure there would have been people in America who would have watched Phantasm and read the whole sort of, they're turning them into slaves and shipping them off to, sort of do something that we never do find out what it is that the Tall Man's trying to do with these slaves, but he's doing something with them. And, that would have been seen very much as a kind of, look, they're being turned into this faceless mass of workers, which, some commentators would have read it as that, I think, in America. I think when I was 17, I was too busy trying to work out what the hell was going on and not cry, to be honest, because I was just so confused by it all.
Well, in terms of trying to work out what's going on, I have to ask you this because I've asked every guest on the podcast so far. In your opinion, who or what is the Tall Man?
I think the Tall Man is a manifestation of Mike's subconscious.
Okay.
I think what we're watching, and for this to work, we kind of have to ignore the twist ending, and we certainly have to ignore the sequels.
Yeah.
But I do buy into the argument that it's basically a dream about a young boy trying to cope with grief.
Yeah, that's always
this is the most popular reading of the film, I think, and I think it's the one that makes the most sense. And I think that the Tall Man is this kind of subconscious sort of thing that's sort of bubbling up inside. I think probably he represents sort of personification of death that took his parents, and which at the, towards the end we find out took Jodie as well. Although that's slightly confusing
depending on which
version you're looking at. But it's so I think the Tall Man is death. I think he's he's the sort of the figure that took Mike's family away, and now it's coming for him. And well, you can understand now why sort of Coscarelli said on a number of occasions that the target audience is quite young.
Yeah,
for Phantasm. Yeah. At 17, I was probably a little bit too old for it.
Possibly,
but, I was quite a naive 17-year-old, and I did sort of identify with Mike and this sort of horrible trauma of, and a few years later I did actually lose one of my parents, and it kind of brought back some of those kind of feelings that Mike was having, the struggle of trying to understand the fear of being left alone and rejected and isolated. I think the tall man sort of quite literally strides through all of this as this figure of death pursuing him. He knows that his parents have already gone. He now understands that one day death is going to come for him. And, it may be tomorrow, he may live a long life, we don't know, but there he is, and he's got his eyes on him already.
Absolutely, yeah. And like we say, it is this sort of coming-of-age thing for Mike in terms of that realisation, which I find interesting because Don's previous film, Kenny and Company, was also a kind of coming-of-age film about young American boys sort of on the cusp of adolescence. And it's, a far cry from Phantasm. It doesn't have that sort of existential bleakness. It's much more of a, I don't want to say cheesy film, but it's very nostalgic. It's very light-hearted, good-natured, but it's poignant. It's a lovely film, actually. I do love it.
Yeah, it's a lovely film, but yeah.
It's a lot of the same cast as Phantasm too. The fortune teller's in it. The fortune teller's granddaughter, the caretaker who's killed by the sphere.
That's right.
Is in it, and obviously Michael Baldwin.
Yeah.
And in that respect, it could be seen as a kind of perverse prequel to Phantasm, which is this kind of sort of joyous coming of age film, as opposed to Phantasm, which is all.
Death and destruction.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So unlike Kenny and Company, Phantasm is a coming-of-age film in the sense that it's 13-year-old protagonist realising that he's going to die one day.
It's about that horrible moment when you realise that mortality is a thing.
Yes, yeah.
When you realise your parents won't be there forever, and then it hits you. That means I'm not going to be here forever.
Too, yeah.
You're very carefree up to a certain age, even later than 17. I think you don't think about death unless it's directly affected you. Most people it doesn't. So you kind of wander along through life, la 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 la. The only death you ever see is in a film and all the rest of it. Then one day it happens. Somebody near to you dies, and that's what Mike's going through. He's trying to process that loss and that grief. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in the film is symbolic of him trying to deal with that loss of his parents.
Yes, and challenging it as well, because back to that idea of the tall man as a personification of death.
Yeah.
This idea that death can be challenged or fought. But then going back to Don's dream, that sort of, which was the germ of the whole thing, it's fundamentally a fear of pursuit.
Yeah, and you can't get away. Yeah.
I know. And viewed through that Phantasm lens, the thing that's pursuing you is your own creeping mortality.
Exactly. It's going to get you no matter how hard or fast or far you run. It will catch you. It's going to come to you eventually.
It's going to get you, yeah. And I think that the reason it appeals to younger viewers so is that you have this character of Mike, especially when I first watched it as a 13-year-old boy. I was the same age as this plucky young protagonist, although he was infinitely cooler than I was because he drove a car, he rode a bike, he drank beers, he could MacGyver his way out of a locked room with a hammer, a bullet, and a drawing pin, and he's prepared to do battle with death. Actually, in an upcoming episode of the podcast, Zoe Swan and I are going to be talking about sort of a Phantasm viewed through a feminist lens, as it were, and kind of examining the film's, especially that first film's portrayals of kind of gender and gender stereotypes, gender roles and whatnot. And one of the things that we're going to talk about that we kind of came to the realization of throughout our chat was that unlike a lot of films of that time, Phantasm doesn't have your traditional damsel in distress.
No.
Or rather, it does, but it's Mike. He is the damsel, and yet he rescues himself. like the aforementioned hammer scene, and I think that's why he's so endearing. But also, it's because that battling the tall man's death, even though it's this coming of age realization, he hasn't quite had that penny drop moment that you mentioned, because he's learned that he's going to die one day, but he hasn't accepted it yet. I think that's so much of the appeal is bound up in that struggle, that defiance.
And I think when you're young, you do think you're invulnerable. How many times, think back on it now and shudder at the stupid things we did when we were kids. And you think now, as a grown adult, more or less, you kind of think, like, what the hell was I doing? I wouldn't dream of doing half the things I did as a kid. My parents used to let me, because I was quite into aircraft, and we lived at the time, we lived very near Birmingham Airport. Pre-Isle of Wight. And they used to let me in the summer holidays, me and my mate next door, cycle up a motorway to get to, or a big dual carriageway to go to the airport, go plane spotting. We were like, 11 or 12 or something. It's like, what the hell were you thinking? I wouldn't dream of doing that now.
No.
Just horrific. But, I think, we are very sort of blasé about death when we're younger. We do it, don't we? We all used to play sort of, sort of soldiers or something. Yeah. Someone would shoot you and you go, and you'd fall over. And that was it. That was death. That's because that's what we saw on television.
That was my favourite game to play. Be the baddie and get shot, fall down dead,
shot, die, and then you get up again and keep on playing.
Yeah.
And suddenly, at some point, you do get that horrible realisation in real life: people fall over and they don't get back up again. And that's I think that's the really sad moment where we really stop being kids.
Yes.
Is when we realise just how final.
Oh, yeah.
My God, this has taken a morbid turn, hasn't it? Oh,
well, it's a film about funerals and death.
Yeah, but exactly, and that's why it needed to be set around a funeral parlour.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because of that, sort of the finality of it all, and this young boy trying to come to grips with that.
Yeah, and interestingly, lots of horror films obviously are about death and have lots of death in them. But in Phantasm, it seems more prevalent as a theme. It really has that sense of that creeping dread.
Oh, of course.
There's blood and guts and death in lots of other horror films. Lots of other horror films from around that period.
Sure.
But often the deaths in those films were, like the kind of childhood games you mentioned of falling down and playing dead.
Yeah.
Whereas with Phantasm, it feels more real, even though it's a very surreal film. The sense of loss in it, especially at the end with Jodie, but even earlier on with Tommy and how his death has clearly affected, Reggie and Jodie and their whole dynamic.
Of course, and in fact, you thought about the blood and gore. It's surprisingly little in it until we get to the sphere bit. The scene that's the sort of the goriest, nastiest bit in it. But there is this sort of pervasive feeling that something is coming for Mike.
Yeah.
It may not be the tall man. There may be something else out there. It may be the lavender lady. It might be one of the little Jawa type creatures. But something's coming for him. Well, something's going to get him.
Funnily enough, one of the few films in recent years, or indeed ever, that's actually reminded me of Phantasm, and it's not very much like Phantasm, but It Follows has that strange, similar sort of. It has the nightmare logic, but also that fundamental theme of pursuit.
Yes,
and I think in both films, the pursuit is that idea of your own mortality. It's always coming for you. Yeah,
and you can't escape from it. No matter what you do, it's going to keep on coming. And you talk about the sort of the nightmare logic. One of the great things about Phantasm that I find is, so I know people who say, it's not a very logical film, is it? Yes, it is. It's perfectly logical. It's just its own logic.
Yes.
It creates a world, a sort of dream world that it happens in. But everything is totally consistent within that. We don't see anything that cheats. There's a lot of things, you'll get things sort of set up earlier on, like when he's at Tommy's funeral on his motorbike, and he sees something running behind one of the gravestones.
Of course,
and that's setting up the little figures from later on in the film.
Yes, yeah.
So it's all consistent. It all makes sense. You can sit and watch it and nitpick it all you like. It still holds together.
Yeah, it does.
But it just holds together in a way that we don't recognise because it's set in this dream world of death. It's not set in the real world.
Of course, yeah. I co-host another podcast, a monthly book discussion podcast, and recently we discussed Boneland by Alan Garner, and there's a wonderful line in there about how science and fairy tales can both be real and both be true, and yet they exist in different spheres, so the laws of one don't necessarily apply to the other, but that doesn't make it not real.
And that's Phantasm to a T. And that's, it's also David Lynch. David Lynch's films don't make any sense if you try and apply real world logic to them. They only work if you buy into the fact that this is its own self-contained world that we've entered. And then it makes perfect sense. And that's, I think one of the reasons why people keep comparing Phantasm to Lynch is the fact they have got these fantastically well thought out, self-contained worlds. They do make perfect sense. This whole idea it doesn't make any sense. It does. You just got to pay attention and just give up any attempt at trying to locate it in the real world.
Exactly. Yeah, that suspension of disbelief.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, you mentioned earlier that you were a record collector, and it feels wrong to talk about Phantasm without mentioning
what a score! What a superb score by Fred Myrow and Malcolm Seagrove. And Malcolm Seagrove didn't really do much else. He did a couple of the sequels. He had, I think he's credited on that, possibly because he wrote some of the themes. Fred Myrow was actually quite a prolific, proper composer.
Yeah.
He'd done Soylent Green. Do you remember Soylent Green in 1973?
Yeah.
Wrote the score for that.
Yes.
Yeah. So he was a proper composer.
Wow.
And he sort of, apparently, according to the things I've read, that he was said to have been influenced by Goblin and Mike Oldfield.
Yeah, I can hear that.
Of course he was influenced by Goblin and Mike Oldfield. You only have to listen to, 2 bars of it and you can hear it. It's like that tinkling piano.
Oh, yeah.
It's not a rip-off of Halloween.
No.
It's a nod towards
Tubular Bells,
Tubular Bells. And of course, wonder where he got the idea for putting Tubular Bells into a horror film from. Let me think about that. But yeah, so, it's a gorgeous score, absolutely fantastic. And it's one of those that works really well. It's a rare one because it works really well even when you're just listening to the soundtrack.
Oh, yeah.
You don't have to have the film on.
No, not
at all. It works as a piece of music.
No, I've got it on vinyl, and many evenings I'll just put the music on and lose myself in it. It's a gorgeous sort of gatefold edition, and there are some liner notes in there written by Don. And he says, and this is really great in terms of that, abandoning all hope of narrative cohesion. He said, treat yourself, put this score on and put the film on and just have the movie playing in silent in the background. And it's a fantastic experience.
It's just like it's an immersive sensory thing, isn't it?
Yes.
It's sort of, it's like this sort of battering of the senses with this sort of gorgeous, I'm sorry, the punks out there will go mad, but I'm a big prog rock fan. So obviously, 1979, I heard this bit of music and I thought, oh my God, this is every Mike Oldfield Genesis Yes album I've ever heard all come together in this horror film. Fantastic,
Yeah. Well, so, interestingly, the Goblin, Suspiria influence is kind of obvious. And, Mike Oldfield. But one thing I didn't know until recently, I think when I read Don's book, is that he gave the composers Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah.
And said, make it sound like this. And once I knew that, I could hear it. When those drums kick in, it could be time, couldn't it?
It could, absolutely. Yeah, they don't go out of their way to hide their influences.
No,
and nor should they.
No,
because every musician has their influences.
Yeah.
It's I played in bands and stuff, and we went around telling people, oh no, we don't sound like anybody else while doing our best Led Zeppelin impression. It's like, yes, of course, everybody sounds like somebody else. Nothing is created in a vacuum. And these guys, this was 1979. They were probably working on it a little earlier than that, even because it took so long to make. They would have grown up.
I think they started in 77.
Yeah, so they would have grown up at the sort of the height of this kind of progressive rock
sort
of thing. So all of this music would have been all around them all the time. It would have seeped in.
Of course.
Consciously or not, it would be in there. And of course it would come out when they start to play. And, there's nothing spookier than a good prog rock song, to be honest.
No.
They can be very atmospheric. So,
And of course, there's music in the film itself.
Oh, yeah.
The boundaries blur. In the bar scene, there's like a disco rendition of the Phantasm theme, which Jodie is then later whistling.
Yeah.
It's so meta.
of the Phantasm theme tune.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, Reggie and Jodie are, Jodie wants to escape the small town.
Yeah.
To go back to playing in a band.
Yeah.
I was 17 years old living on the Isle of Wight playing in a band. I mean, this guy was my hero.
Of course.
Okay, he was a bit of a shit, to be honest, because he was going to leave poor old Mike and sort of dump him on his aunt and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But as a 17-year-old, I totally got it. I wanted to leave the Isle of Wight. I wanted to get away from the big city and be a rock and roll star and all the rest of it.
We all did,
so I could totally get that. And there is a really lovely bit where him and Reggie are bonding, just sitting outside with their guitars. Just playing it and
here at midnight.
It's a lovely little moment.
It is, and I think that divides people who like Phantasm, people who don't. Some people would watch that and say, what was the point of that? It didn't further the film in any way. But others would say that's the heart of Phantasm. That's what it's all about.
It does further it because it's so Reggie is kind of the outsider in this setup. And by the end, he is the sort of the surrogate big brother. And this is him sort of. This is Coscarelli saying, look, he is part of the team.
Yeah,
he's part of the little gang. He's an integral part of it because the two older guys share this kind of love of music and particular kind of music. And Mike looks up to Reggie in the same way he looks up to Jodie. And that's one of the lovely things about Phantasm, I think, for all the weirdness, for all the surrealism and strangeness, it's actually about three blokes who love each other.
Yes, it
and
is.
There's no sort of shame about these guys actually being really good friends and brothers. And it's like
there's a real warmth to it.
There is a real warmth.
Yeah.
It's very rare in horror films. You'll often get a bunch of guys who are horsing around and sort of being a bit leering. And in later films, Reggie gets a little bit like that. I think.
he becomes
a bit.
He's
permanently randy in the sequels, and he's always trying to have sex with something. But
as I've got older, those have been the elements of the films that have bothered me a little bit more than they did when I was younger.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting actually. In my first episode, I spoke to Mary Wilde.
Oh yeah,
and she kind of saved it for me with her take on that. That Reggie stands in permanent opposition to the tall man, who's completely sexless and he's just preoccupied with death. And so Reggie exists as the life force to the tall man's death drive.
Yeah,
and that idea that his permanent quest to get laid. Yeah, it's cringeworthy to watch occasionally some of the bits in the sequels, but fundamentally it represents something quite pure, which is just to carry on living,
Well, I read somewhere once years ago, I'm not sure how true this is, but I read it once years ago, that people can often find at funerals that they're actually feeling quite sexy.
Yeah, I'd read that. I've read that, yeah.
Yeah, the thinking was that because death has taken away life, something has triggered inside us. We want to create new life.
Exactly, yeah.
To show death that we can still do this.
Yes.
And maybe I think she's got a point there. I think, to Reggie, for all his blustery macho nonsense and all the rest of it, I think he's just behaving in this way that, death is coming for us all. So before it comes here, let's try and create something new.
Exactly.
New life,
Yeah.
Maybe I'm letting him off the hook, I don't know, but it kind of feels right.
Yeah, well, Reggie aside, and again, this is quite crass, so I apologise to any listeners out there, but I've read that apparently a hanged man will get an erection just before he dies.
Yes.
And it's just that idea of the body trying one last desperate attempt.
Yeah, to perpetuate my line, my
carry
dreams
on.
must live on.
Yeah,
and given that it is all very funerary and it is all about death and the end of things, I think sort of maybe it's slightly clumsy, but I think that is what's happening with Reggie. That maybe he is just trying to. On the other hand, he might just be a randy little sod who's got no self-control. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's up to the individual viewer. So,
I think it is, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, that positive male friendship and that love between the characters, stands in stark opposition to, the bleak elements of the film that we were talking about earlier, that it's all about funerals and death and loss and grief. And yet it's not a depressing film. It's a film that's full of warmth, and it's dreamlike, it's surreal, and maybe even psychedelic. But I think that palpable sense of the characters' love for one another is why Phantasm has kind of stood the test of time in many ways. I think in the last decade or so, there's been this tendency to make characters as dislikable as possible in horror films.
In fairness, I'm not even entirely sure it's just been in the last decade or so. I mean, I can remember in the 70s and particularly the early 80s when I was watching probably more slasher films than was sensible for anybody, to be perfectly honest. The characters in it were so awful. Like you just wanted them to die. The big difference in Phantasm, I think, is you don't want them to die.
You really root for them.
Even Mike, and sort of God knows how many sort of young teenagers we saw in those slasher movies who were playing jokes on people and just being bloody annoying. You were just kind of hoping that Freddy would catch up with them or Jason had slaughtered them or whatever. In this one, he's not like that at all.
No, not at all.
You're totally with Mike the whole time. Because of the trauma he's suffered, we understand him. We get him. And he's a very likeable character. That clinginess, that's even the sort of weird, sort of creepy scenes like him spying on his brother when he's having sex with that's actually... Again, I'm not justifying this, and I'm not owning up to anything. Honest, I was the older brother, so I can get away with this. But I think, when you're 13, you're so fascinated by sex. It doesn't matter who's doing it. If you see someone doing it, you want to watch it because you don't understand it. It's kind of like...
He's just curious.
Curiosity. You've got all these sort of hormones flowing, but you're not quite sure what it all means yet.
Yeah. But I also think that Mike has this, almost a fear of sex or sort of fear of female sexuality because he fears that that's the thing that will take his brother away from him. Fear.
Exactly. So, even when he's being a bit creepy by modern standards, I can kind of understand him. Okay, that's probably tarred me with a brush now, and I'll probably be known as that creepy bloke from the podcast. But no, I totally get it.
No, I agree with you, and I think that the intention behind these films has always been very innocent, and Phantasm has a massive female fan base. Although there are some people who say, these are just films for guys, and I can see why. I mean, I don't agree, and I know lots of women who don't agree with that. But on the one hand, I can see, because you've got this sort of very male-driven franchise, and again, in this first film, we have these three main male characters. But I don't really see that as in any way a negative thing in Phantasm, because, like you say, they love each other and they're honest about that, and they're quite whatever the opposite of toxic masculinity is. They have this really positive relationship, and I think they're positive role models. And we're so affected by Reggie's apparent death near the end of the film. And then we have this sort of roller coaster of emotions where you find out that actually it was a dream and there's Reggie, he's still alive, but it's Jodie who's died. And it is so affecting. But then you get that moment with Reggie, hugging Mike and saying, I know I can't ever take Jodie's place, but I'm sure as hell going to try. And it's just so lovely.
Yeah, it's beautiful, isn't it? And, you get a very similar scene right at the end of Ravager, which is not a film I'm particularly fond of, I have to say, the final film. But you do get that wonderful bit of circularity where when you first meet Reggie and Jodie, they're saying, what a way to break up a trio. And at the end, they're saying, what a way to start a trio. And you just think, it is that kind of, I think I may have something in my eye.
Yeah,
moment,
absolutely.
And we could witter on all we like about, yes, it's a bit of a sausage fest, it's all blokes and all the rest of it. But I think sometimes when it's done like this, when it's done with real warmth and it shows that sort of male friendships and male relationships can be positive and nurturing and protective, I don't see there's a problem in that. I think we should have more of those.
Definitely,
less of the sort of the bro hijinks that you get in all the slasher movies. Much more like these three guys who they adore each other.
They do.
They have strange ways of showing it because they're men. That's what we do. We can't show our emotions. We're rubbish, but they do love each other.
Repress your emotions and instead have nightmares about being pursued by spheres.
I mean, if we want to really get into it, it's a man being pursued by his balls, isn't it? So I mean, there's probably something in that, but let's not go
probably
down that
shouldn't
route.
go there. No.
Days. But yeah, I think I do like the idea that these guys are very likable and they care about each other.
Yes.
And that is so rare in a horror film.
It is,
really
isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think, even though there are elements of it that are dated because it was made in the late 1970s, I think that, that is why the film still appeals to so many people.
Of course. And any film, to be honest, any film is dated about 30 seconds after it's been released.
Yeah.
You know, it's inevitable. That's just the march of time. But I think Phantasm still works. I think you can still watch it. There are moments in there, you know, some of the humour is a little bit late 70s, you know, the bizarre shot of Jodie with the woman's knickers in his mouth, you know. I think, oh, please, guys, come on, that was crap in 1979. It doesn't fly now. But a lot of it, you can watch it now. And I did. I watched it just last night.
Oh, wow.
And it still works.
Yeah.
It still works. It doesn't feel particularly late 70s, a lot of it. It just feels kind of timeless.
Well, I was worried when I watched the 4K restoration version that it would have lost something in translation, you know, because sometimes, especially things from the 70s, when they're sort of spruced up digitally, they lose some of their magic somehow.
Sure.
And I think that when you lose that fuzziness, you become aware of sort of dodgy props or wobbly sets. So I was a little bit worried about seeing Phantasm exposed like that, but it was fantastic. It was absolutely brilliant. I think, you know, that Morningside mausoleum set is so well made. It just looked fantastic on the big screen.
And of course, because it's set in a dream world, dream worlds don't age.
No,
doesn't have to look real. Doesn't have to look. You know, it can be a little bit fuzzy here and there. It can be a little bit sort of like that doesn't quite. Yeah, I don't quite understand the geography of the mausoleum. That's right. You shouldn't understand the geography of the mausoleum. And, you know, it helps with the aging process. I don't think it's aged anywhere near as badly as a lot of films from 1979.
Oh, in fact, a lot of films from the 90s where they started using terrible CGI.
Oh, yeah.
They look terrible by 2005 even, you know.
Look, I think, to be honest, it's more timeless than a lot of the sequels.
Yeah.
I think the sequels look more of their time than Phantasm does.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the franchise, you know, and all the sequels. But obviously, the original will always hold that special place in my heart. And I do like Phantasm 2 a lot. But yeah, it looks like a bigger budget studio horror movie, and I think in many ways that's its charm. But it's got more action. It's got more gore, more special effects. You know, it looks like an 80s action horror movie. You know,
of course.
Whereas the original is more timeless. But for me, the only one of the sequels that really came close, and came very close for me to recapturing that magic and that sort of surrealism of the original was the fourth film. Yes,
Oblivion, yeah.
And it had a much lower budget than 2 and 3, which I think kind of gave it its strength.
And there were, of course... There was footage from 1979 in there, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Wasn't it? It was 3 hours long,
the
original cut of Phantasm, and they said, no, you can't do that. And so, you know, we now need to make it our job to go out there and hunt down these stupid executives who robbed us of an hour and a half of Phantasm, you know. But, you know, they made him cut it down, which I think, in fairness, in retrospect, probably added to the dreamlike qualities.
I think so,
You know, I think if we... Some of the footage that we do see later in the series that was shot around there, you think, oh, you're explaining stuff. Right, okay. Now I understand why that's gone, because I didn't need to know that in 1979. It wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, it's the thing we've talked about before, about how, you know, the non-linear surrealist nature of it only adds to its charm, and I think that with all those scenes that were cut, you end up with this very strange progression from scene to scene without necessarily
just like a dream
effect.
Just like a dream. Your dreams suddenly jump from one thing to the next without any, you know, context or interstitial stuff. You know, yeah, works perfectly.
But in terms of its legacy, what sort of influence do you think that Phantasm has had on the sci-fi horror genre?
Well, I think straight off the bat, I think you'd have to say that Wes Craven watched it and liked it, because I think we can see so much of it in Nightmare on Elm Street.
Oh, definitely.
All the dream sequences look like they could have come from that. You know, you've got Freddy chopping his fingers off.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, we got the sort of, you know, the strange fingers business in Phantasm. So I think that's definitely in there. I would like to have thought that it had more of an influence than it did. I would like to have seen a lot more films being as daring as Phantasm. I think it was one of those films that was so odd. And again, you know, sorry, we're going to come back to David Lynch, aren't we? I kind of promised myself beforehand I wasn't going to mention David Lynch, because everybody talked about David Lynch when it comes to Phantasm. But I think, it's like with David Lynch, you can't make a David Lynch film.
No.
And I don't think you can make a Phantasm, to be honest. I think Ravager kind of proved that. There are bits in Ravager that I liked, but because Don Coscarelli didn't direct it, I think only Don Coscarelli can make a Phantasm film. There's something in that man's brain. There's something that's not quite wired up right, thank God. And, that's what this sort of weird little sort of imaginative short circuit that gave us Phantasm. And I think nobody tried to copy it, I don't think, not directly, because how could you?
How could you?
How could you replicate that?
There have been so many threats over the years from studios wanting to remake it or reboot it, and I'm so glad that Don has always held on to creative control of that franchise in, over 40 years.
I think if they did, I think it'd be a race between me and you to hunt them down and kill them before they could actually get the first scene shot.
Absolutely.
Do not touch this film. There are some films you'd never, ever try to remake. Phantasm, Jaws, The Exorcist. Yes, I know they're going to try, but these are films you should never, ever touch. Ever. Don't ever touch them. They are perfect as they are. You can't. The arrogance of someone who watches Phantasm and thinks, you know what, I can do better than that.
Yeah.
No, you can't. I can promise you right now, I don't care who you are, unless you're Don Coscarelli, you cannot do better than Phantasm. I'm sorry. It's perfect as it is. Leave it alone. Just don't touch it.
So there we have it. Good old Phantasm, made for 30p with a bit of sticky tape, and it's perfect and untouchable. Kevin, thank you so much for talking with me tonight.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. No, it's been great.
And thanks for going out of your way for watching Phantasm last night. It must have been such a chore.
Oh, it was such hard work. I cannot tell you the torment and terror I had to go through to watch Phantasm again. In fact, I'm so traumatised by it, I might have to watch it again next week. But
it's the only thing
I think I
should.
Work.
Yeah. Listen, Kevin, before I let you go, I'm going to put you on the spot, like I do with all my guests, with a question from this unauthorised Phantasm quiz book by Killian H. Gore. So here we go. The word phantasm was used frequently in the works of which famous horror writer?
Oh, that would be Edgar Allan Poe, wouldn't it?
There you go.
Yeah, he didn't even need this. Look at that.
Multiple choice.
I tell you what, you don't get to be an old fart like me. Just turn 60 and not know a few things. That's one of the few joys of being old is this stuff. It's
brilliant.
Simple stuff like where did I leave my phone, or why did I forget to go shop for food today? Hopeless. Phantasm from Edgar Allan Poe.
The
important stuff.
Yeah.
Of course, that stays there forever.
Because the original working title was Morningside.
It was indeed.
Yeah, and then I think Reggie and Don. Oh, Poe keeps using this word, phantasm.
And there is also that sort of. Sorry, just to keep rambling on a little bit more. Phantasm is that sort of combination of fantasy and orgasm.
Of course.
So it brings us back to the whole sort of sex and death thing.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, it was released in Australia as The Never Dead, because there was already a softcore porn film called Phantasm.
There was Phantasm with an F rather than a PH. Yes, that's right, yeah.
Yes, there you go. Fantasy and orgasm.
Yeah, there you
go.
What a note to end on. Perfect.
Right, Kevin, where can people find you online?
They can find me all over the place. EOFF TV, that's the name of my main website. So it's EOFF TV Review. You can find me on Facebook under EOFF TV. You can find me on Twitter, EOFF TV. To be honest, I'm never far away. I'm sort of I keep turning up like a bad penny on things. I don't quite know why people keep asking me back to drone on about things, but they do. So I'm always around somewhere. But come and say hello on Facebook or Twitter. And we can talk about Phantasm to your heart's content there.
Fantastic. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks once again to my guest, Kevin Lyons. Do definitely check out his Encyclopedia of Fantastic Film and Television. It is a remarkable site. And check out his Phantasm article on there while you're at it. Anyway, talking of positive, nurturing and protective male friendships, join me next time when my guest will be my oldest friend and co-host of my other podcast, A Book at Breakfast, Mark Charlesworth, and he will be joining me to discuss Kate Coscarelli's legendary Phantasm novelisation. In the meantime, don't forget to follow us on Instagram at PhantasmPod and subscribe to Morningside FM wherever you get your podcasts.